welcome to Chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. This is also the start of Period 7. Let's get started. A couple of key points this time. First of all, progressives, they're not trying to radically change the system. In fact, they want to work within it. And their goal is to strengthen the state and to use government as an agency of human welfare. So corrupt business and big business and trusts was a big target for the progressives. You can see Henry Damaris Lloyd in his Wealth Against the Commonwealth, really critical of Standard Oil. Another target would be social injustices and social evils, and Jacob Riis in his How the Other Half Lives really exposes slum life. A pretty iconic photo here. You can see how many folks are crowded into this small tenement. We've been talking about the impact of the printed word all year long, and how it can change public opinion and bring about change. And now there's a group of reform-minded journalists, and we call them the muckrakers. President Roosevelt actually coined that term. And their goal or their hope was to sort of expose the truth in society and bring about change as a result of that. And so some examples of them in 1902, Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of the Cities, and really I think he's attacking here political machines, as you see municipal governments and big business. Ida Tarbell, with her History of the Standard Oil Company, really taking Rockefeller head on. Some of the most effective attacks the muckrakers were directed at social evils. As you can see here, Ray Stannard Baker's Following the Color Line, looking at racial injustice, and John Spargo in his The Bitter Cry of the Children, talking about the abuse of child labor. And here's a cartoon to show you that other people aside from Tarbell were really second guessing or starting to rethink what the Standard Oil Company was or what trusts were. But here is Tarbell. Progressive reformers were most likely to be middle class men and women now, and it's important to think about that because they're not really necessarily living the experiences that they're trying to change, but they're in a position where they're removed enough from it, they're educated, they have leisure time, they have the means to do something about it, and their goals really are twofold, as I said, sort of to use state power to control the trusts and to improve the common person's conditions of life and labor. Progressives wanted to regain the power that had shifted from the hands of the people into the interests, that is. Progressives supported the initiative so that voters could directly propose legislation, and they supported the referendum so they could vote directly on laws, and they also advocated for a recall, which gave the people the ability to remove corrupt elected officials, respectively. Progressive reformers also convinced Congress to pass the 17th Amendment in 1913, and it allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators. And as you can see in this cartoon here, the concern was, as state legislatures chose senators prior to this amendment, the concern was that there was a very large class of wealthy people in the Senate. In fact, they called it the Millionaires Club. Obviously, there are progressive efforts at the state and city level as well, and the states begin to use public utility commissioners to regulate railroads and trusts. Robert La Follette, as you can see in the bottom right corner, there's a picture, was the governor of Wisconsin. He took control from corrupt corporations and returned to the people. In California, Hiram W. Johnson helped to break the grip of the Southern Pacific Railroad on California politics in 1910. At the turn of the century, there still existed a belief in separate spheres, that men and women, sort of operated in different aspects of life, and women, of course, were expected to operate and really be in charge of the home. And so, as the text says, the settlement house movement is sort of a side door for women into public life, and that in itself is radical. This does predate women's suffrage, obviously. So the most famous of those settlement houses is Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago. And a settlement house really was a facility for immigrants. They could go there and receive all types of services that they may need as they settle into a new place. Here is Jane Addams here teaching some young school children about the market revolution. Women are heavily involved in the progressive movement, and they don't necessarily reject their motherly role that's been assigned to them. In fact, you could make the case, as the pageant does, that their progressive efforts are an extension of that maternal role. So temperance groups like the WCTU that you see here often pose their arguments in defense of families, protecting against abusive husbands and warning of child neglect and child abuse. Similarly, the National Consumers League in 1899, which eventually will be led by Florence Kelley, will mobilize female consumers to pressure for laws that will safeguard women and children in the workplace. court cases here. Mueller versus Oregon, 1908, ruled it constitutional to enact laws that specifically protected female factory workers. And while they based that argument on the fact that these jobs were dangerous to the frail bodies of females, it still was heralded as a progressive move in its day. Lochner v. New York actually invalidated a New York law that limited the workday to 10 hours for bakers, but 7 years later the court upheld laws for a 10-hour day for factory workers. Mueller. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a tragedy to bring about real change, and that's exactly what happened at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in 1911 in New York City. When the fire broke out, obviously many women couldn't get out. In fact, some preferred to jump from the building as opposed to die in the flames. But 146 women did die, the youngest of which was 14 years old. And this did lead to New York and eventually other states passing more safety regulations for the workplace. And by 1917, 30 states had workmen's comp laws on the books. And here's a scene from that day. President Roosevelt believed in progressive reform, and he enacted a square deal program that consisted of three parts: control for the corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. 1902, the coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike and demanded a 20% raise in pay and a workday decrease from 10 hours to 9 hours. When the mine spokesman, George F. Baer, refused to negotiate, Roosevelt stepped in and threatened to operate the mines with federal troops. Now, a compromise was struck in which the miners received 10% pay raise and a 9-hour workday. The increasing hostilities between capital and labor forced Congress to create the Department of Commerce in 1903, and this department provided oversight of business engaged in interstate commerce. And here's a little cartoon here titled Roosevelt's Biggest Game, still using these sort of frontiersman, hunter, adventurer / rough rider images with Roosevelt as he tackled the coal strike this time. Keep in mind, the Interstate Commerce Act was pretty weak, and railroads were circumventing the I.C.C. by appealing to federal courts. That's something we already talked about. So Congress does pass new legislation, including the Elkins Act 1903, which fined railroads that gave rebates, as well as the shippers that accepted them, and the Hepburn Act 1906, which restricted free passes and expanded the Interstate Commerce Commission. Free passes were rewards offered to companies in the form of free shipments or given to companies to encourage future business. All right, so watch your stomach on this one. Here in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act, it stated that the preparation of meat shipped over state lines was subject to federal inspection, and that's a reaction to the poor quality of meat and the fact that meat often had spoiled and was repackaged and sold on to the consumer again. Similarly, the Pure Food and Drug Act 1906 set out to prevent the adulteration and mislabeling of foods and pharmaceuticals. Back to the Meat Inspection Act by The Jungle here by Upton Sinclair, which is something I think we already talked about, really was about sort of tenement life and factory life. And as Sinclair said, that he had aimed for the nation's heart but hit its stomach, and he sort of accidentally exposed the truths of the meatpacking industry. Now, this Pure Food and Drug Act is really, in a way, out to attack the patent medicine industry. And again, anybody could really create their own recipe and promise sort of all of these wonderful effects of this magic tonic. As you can see here, the oil of gladness, which cures all pains and aches. And how about this blood purifier by Professor E. Loring? Sounds legit. You may recall Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, in which he argued that Americans in the frontier developed this unique American character full of a variety of traits, and one of those was wastefulness. And so there's a real concern about disappearing frontier and disappearing sort of untouched land in the United States, and the federal government embarks on a real effort to fight that. And so several conservation efforts are made. You can see acts here along that, many of which have to do with irrigation. Roosevelt, down the bottom, you can see, really pushes for a policy of multiple use resource management. And so what that means is that you'll have a protected area, but it also will be used for recreation, logging, watershed protection, and cattle grazing. So it's not just preserving an area because that was believed to be wasteful by some, including Roosevelt. Instead, it's being used, but being used wisely. Teddy Roosevelt was reelected as president in 1904. Don't forget he took over for McKinley to begin with when McKinley was shot. But he did make it known pretty publicly that he did not plan to run for a third term. Following that, there is a small economic panic, and it did result in some financial reforms, including the Aldrich and Freeland Act of 1908, which authorized national banks to issue emergency currency in the event of a currency shortage. Again, with a Rough Rider, look at San Juan Hills right in the back. And so obviously Roosevelt's not going to run in 1908, and the Republicans will nominate the former Secretary of War under Roosevelt. That's William Howard Taft. You can see him on the right there. And he'll run against William Jennings Bryan. Now, Taft is going to win this, but as a Republican, keep in mind that, Roosevelt has sort of made the Republican Party a bit more progressive, and the expectation is that Taft is going to continue that. Here's the map. You can still see the South voting solidly Democratic here, and the Republican Party having the support of the Northeast and the Northwest and pretty much everything in between. Now, Taft was not really a great president, and that might be sort of exaggerated because he followed Roosevelt. He's in Roosevelt's shadow, but he certainly was very passive with Congress, whereas Roosevelt, as I said before, was very bold and very adamant that the president should be strong and should lead. Take a look at this cartoon. I just happened upon this one here. Roosevelt, the shepherd, with my policies. And another, this one's in our book, actually. So Taft kind of steps away from big stick diplomacy and instead embraces dollar diplomacy. And this idea was that Wall Street bankers, and this is encouraged by Taft, Wall Street bankers should invest in foreign areas of strategic interest to the U.S. American bankers can then strengthen American defenses and foreign alliances and foreign policy, and at the same time bring about prosperity to the United States. An example of this would be with Japan and Russia. Both controlled China's Manchuria region, and Taft feared that this monopoly would eventually hurt American merchants. So, in 1909, Secretary of State Knox proposed that Americans buy the Manchurian railroads and then turn them over to the Chinese. Obviously, both Japan and Russia rejected the selling of these railroads. So not only was Taft ridiculed for his failure in Japan and Russia, he's got a lot on his plate in terms of events happening in Latin America. Now, the government was urging bankers to pump money into Haiti and Honduras. Again, there's concern that European powers will intervene if we do not. We've got this Monroe Doctrine to uphold. There's also revolutions in Cuba, Honduras, and Dominican Republic. There's an upheaval in Nicaragua in which 2,500 Marines were sent in, and they remained there for 13 years. One thing to Taft's credit that he does not necessarily get credit for, it would be his trust busting. He actually issued 90 lawsuits against trust during his 4 years in office, which is far more than Roosevelt, as you can see. Yet again, we always consider Roosevelt the trust buster. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company, stating that it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Also in 1911, the Supreme Court's Rule of Reason doctrine was issued, and this stated that a trust was illegal only if it unreasonably restrained trade. Now, if you're looking at this slide and asking a question, I think you're on the right track here, because you know that Republicans typically want to raise tariffs. But as you can see, in 1909, many Republicans, at least this progressive Republican branch, really want to see a reduction in tariffs. They called it the mother of all trusts. And so Taft had promised that as part of his campaign, and in fact he did sign a tariff, the Payne-Aldrich tariff, in 1909, which was slightly reduced. Unfortunately, by the time it got to his desk, it was not nearly as low as it could have been, and therefore he received some criticism for that. Taft was a conservationist, but unfortunately he made a move that caused him to lose a lot of support. In 1910, he fired the chief of Agricultural Department's Division of Forestry, Gifford Pinchot, for insubordination, and Pinchot was well liked by the progressives. This is known as the Bollinger-Pinchot Quarrel. By the spring of 1910, a reformist wing in the Republican Party was furious with Taft, causing the Republican Party to split outright. Well, if there's one thing I know, you just can't count Roosevelt out, right? Now, 1911, the National Progressive Republican League was formed, and Bob La Follette was the leading candidate for that presidential nomination of the Republicans. But in February of 1912, Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the Republican presidential nomination. And so They got rid of La Follette, and in comes Roosevelt, and now he and Taft will be opponents because Roosevelt felt that he really just wasn't as progressive as he needed to be. Taft did win the nomination, however, because the Roosevelt Republicans refused to vote at the 1912 Republican Convention. I think they had some concerns with fraud, and Roosevelt will continue on as a third-party candidate, and it'll be a progressive party that he is at the helm of. I just love this cartoon right here. And of course, it'll be the Bull Moose Party. We'll see them next chapter, I think. But that's it for tonight, so thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or just let me know in class tomorrow. Take care.